victim at a time. The first piece of evidence commonly cited in favor of the Apollo missions comes in the form of reasoning. If it's true that NASA faked the moon landings, goes the argument, why did the Russians keep mum instead of exposing the hoax to the entire world?
I russi sono stati zitti perché? Nessuno se lo sa spiegare.
There are in fact different reasons why the Russians would not have exposed the fake landings in any case. The first one is that, given their position, no one in the world would have believed them. Just imagine if the Russians, who had just lost the race to the moon, had tried to suggest that NASA faked the moon landings. The Americans would have ridiculed them in front of the entire world, calling them sore losers. With more than 500 million people having just witnessed the moon landings on television, it would have been very easy to dismiss any Russian accusation with a laugh. Had the claim come from a neutral nation, then maybe it would have been somewhat believable. But coming from the same people who had just lost the race to the moon, no one would have taken them seriously. There is also a second, very important reason why the Russians would not have exposed the hoax in any case. With the Apollo mission still in progress, serious talks between the Americans and the Russians about a joint space program had already been on their way. The times were no longer those of Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Nixon administration had made some serious progress towards a substantial détente with the Soviet Empire.
We have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation.
On May 24, 1972, in Moscow, with the Apollo missions still in full swing, Richard Nixon signed a historic agreement with the Soviets on space cooperation. And less than a year after the last Apollo mission, the same American astronauts were traveling to Russia to meet their Soviet colleagues. They took part in joint press conferences, visited their space center, got familiar with their spaceship Soyuz, and paid homage to the grave of the heroes of the Soviet space program, Sergei Korolev and Yuri Gagarin. A few months later, it was the Soviet cosmonauts' turn to visit the U.S. and get acquainted with the American way of life. They visited the Houston Space Center, familiarized with the American spaceship Apollo, and worked together with their counterparts to perfect the system that would allow their spaceships to connect to each other during future joint missions. All of this would culminate only 3 years after the last Apollo mission in the historic encounter between the American spaceship Apollo and the Russian spaceship Soyuz. These are the words by Soviet cosmonaut Leonov before departing for the joint mission with the Americans in space.
Chairman of the State Commission, the crew of the Soyuz spaceship is ready for the joint flight with the American spaceship Apollo. We have the great honor of participating in the first international flight of manned spaceships. The fulfillment of this experiment will yield still broader possibilities in our space research.
On the American side, the tone of the comments was just as appeasing.
The mission climaxed more than 3 years of planning and preparation, a time during which differences in language, in technology, in political creed were set aside in favor of the common goal.
In fact, the joint mission between the Russians and the Americans would pave the way to what is today the International Space Station, a place where astronauts from the U.S., Russia, Italy, Japan, and many other countries work elbow to elbow in the international space program. In conclusion, had the Russians exposed the lunar hoax by the Americans, not only would the entire world have laughed at them, but nothing of what followed in terms of space cooperation with the Americans would have ever been possible. Faced with a possible bluff by the Americans, all there would have been left for the Russians to do was to bite the bullet and look at the future with a smile on their face.
As all philosophers say, the best part of a good dinner is not what you eat, but with whom you eat.
The second piece of evidence often used in favor of the moon landings is the following. With over 400,000 people involved in the NASA project, goes the argument, someone sooner or later would have spilled the beans.
Poi vabbè, si può considerare una cosa molto banale. All'operazione Luna parteciparono 400.000 tecnici di società private, non militari, non era un'operazione di 4 gatti che lanciano un missile. Quindi tutta questa gente in 40 anni non ha mai confessato nulla.
But it's the very premise to this argument that is flawed. Nowhere does it say that all 400,000 NASA employees had to be informed of the scam being perpetrated. In fact, the lunar landing project had been split among thousands of different companies that worked all over the United States, totally independent from one another. The employees from Grumman were building the lunar module in their factories in Long Island. The technicians from ILC were designing the spacesuits in their laboratories in Delaware. The employees from Boeing were building the lunar rover in the state of Washington. The people from McDonnell Douglas worked on the Saturn rocket in their factories in California. The technicians from General Motors were producing the tanks for the command module at their home in Indiana. The experts from the Link Group developed the flight simulators in their factories in New York. As told in this documentary from that era, there were about 20,000 different companies working at the same time on the Apollo project from all over the United States.
More than 90% of the work is conducted by contractors spread across the nation. In fact, some 20,000 prime contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers located in virtually every state are participating in the manned spaceflight programs.
Thus, the idea that all these people had to be in on a plan to fake the moon landings is simply ludicrous. When a soccer player chooses to sell out a game, he certainly does not inform the rest of his team of his intentions. He acts alone, and the first ones to be duped are, in fact, his own teammates. Another example is the so-called Volkswagen scandal. In 2015, it was revealed that the German automaker had deceived the entire world by selling them cars whose engines exceeded the established emission regulations. But this doesn't mean that the entire body of 600,000 workers at Volkswagen had been informed of the scam being perpetrated. All that was needed was a restricted group of managers and technicians in the know, without everyone else necessarily being informed of what was going on. Also, in the case of the Apollo missions, all that was needed was a small group of NASA's top managers who decided to fake the moon landings, while everyone else at the agency would have believed that the missions were real. For the hoax to succeed, for example, it would have been sufficient to take control of the television signal that was received by the stations on Earth. Officially, the images from the first moonwalk were transmitted directly from the moon and were broadcasted in real time by the television stations all over the world. But if the same moonwalk had been pre-recorded in a studio instead and was then rebroadcast to the receiving stations by a satellite or any other means, then the first people to be duped would have been the very technicians at NASA who were following the moon landings from Houston Space Center. And with them, the entire world would have been deceived.